Ta-da! All right, so yeah, my name is Matty Stratton. I work at Pulumi, and that's going to be the extent of how much I talk about Pulumi. If you want to talk about Pulumi later, please let's do that. We're infrastructure as code, we're hiring, that's sort of the rule. Everyone's hiring, so cool. But we're going to talk about the journey from DevOps to cloud engineering. And there's going to be a little bit of a history lesson in here. There's going to be a little bit of a how did we get where we are. And so we're going to start by looking back. And Josh kind of talked a little bit about the history of DevOpsDays Raleigh, which is awesome. Mentioned a couple things. We're sitting here in the year of Beyonce 2022, and DevOps is 13 years old at this point, right? This was a lot easier in 2019 when the math was easy, right? So we're going to kind of start by looking back. And 2009 was a real inflection point with a lot of the stuff we're talking about. So one thing was at the Velocity conference in 2009, these two cats, John Allspot and Paul Hammond from Flickr, they gave a talk called 10 Deploys a Day, Dev plus Ops Cooperation at Flickr. So the first thing is, 10 deploys a day, that blew everybody's frickin' mind that Flickr was able to deploy 10 times a day. And they were really talking about why they were able to do that. Now, one of the fun things about this talk is everyone got wound up about asking how they actually implemented the technology to do that, and not the cooperation piece. This is going to be an ongoing theme. Now, you may be wondering, you may have asked yourself, where did the word DevOps come from? Because we argue about this word a lot. And as best we can tell from some Twitter archaeology, is the first use of the word DevOps on Twitter was Andrew Clay Schaefer watching this talk, and he tweeted, this is the first use of DevOps. And we're going to talk a little bit about how Andrew is an awesome dude and also completely made our life difficult by calling it DevOps, but that's spoiler for the rest talk. So this happened in 2009. Also in 2009, Jez Humble and Dave Farley wrote a book, published a book, I think I wrote it before 2009, called Continuous Delivery. Raise your hand if you've read this book, if this book is sitting on your shelf. Raise your hand if you won this book from ThoughtWorks and a sponsor sometime, right? I've actually won it from ThoughtWorks 5 times because I keep trying to win Lego and they keep giving me the book. But anyway, still very relevant book. And then also in 2009, Gary Groover and some other cats wrote this book about how it has nothing to do with the word DevOps, but really they're talking about DevOps, and it's about how they were deploying software for HP LaserJet firmware. And fun little fact is, when I was first learning about DevOps, I was listening to DevOps Cafe, which was a podcast. Jez Humble was the guest, and I was sitting there, I was working for a .com at the time, driving down the Eisenhower Expressway in Chicago, arguing with my radio that this would never work at apartments.com, and then Jez talks about how Gary Groover did it for printer firmware, and I was like, oh, okay. But anyway, these are all things that happened in 2009. So, and then another thing that happened in 2009, I kind of got ahead of myself, but one thing that happened at that Velocity conference is Andrew Schaefer proposed a birds of a feather session, kind of like open spaces that we're going to do later. And he said he wanted to talk about agile system administration. One person showed up to that birds of a feather session. It wasn't Andrew. It was this Belgian guy named Patrick Dubois. So later, Andrew and Patrick got connected and they decided to put on a conference. And Agile System Administration was too long of a name for a conference, so they called it DevOps Days. So the reason I bring this up is the first DevOps Days took place in Ghent in Belgium in 2009, and these were the 6 talks. And I look at this and I'm like, almost all of these talks could be on the program at this event today. And then over the years, DevOps Days continued around the world, and you can sort of see this growth. And yes, the hockey stick growth kind of ended in 2019. I don't know if you remember, something happened in 2020 that might have affected that. But, we went from, in 2009, there was 1 DevOps Days. In 2019, there were 73 around the world. And at the 10th anniversary of DevOps Days Ghent in 2019, we had an organizer summit. Did I? Did something happen? Oh, good. As long as y'all can hear me, that's good. Okay. I usually don't even need a mic. But anyway, we had an organizer summit. We said, okay, we're going to bring together people who organize DevOps Days from all over the world. There were more people at that organizer summit than were at the very first DevOps Days in Ghent. So it's a global phenomenon. And the reason this matters is because DevOps as a movement comes from the community. It comes from us. right? This is where it was driven. This was not someone wrote a bunch of standard books, you know, maybe some type of infrastructure library or something. This was the community of practitioners and how we came about. So we have to talk about definitions because, you know, and there's a couple different definitions of DevOps that I like. Good DevOps copy, great DevOps steal, so I'm going to steal from some of these folks. So Donovan Brown at Microsoft, he said that DevOps is a union of people, process, and products to enable continuous delivery of value to the end users. I like it, that's good. I can also tell that did not come off the cuff. I think Donovan kind of polished that one up a little bit. So on the other hand, about a year or two ago, I cornered Andrew Schaefer, and I said, Andrew, I want you to give me a definition of DevOps. He said, I don't want to do it. And he said, I'm going to make you do it because I need it for my slide deck. And so this is what he gave me. And he said, it's optimizing the human experience and performance of operating software with software and humans. Clearly, this is a first draft. However, there's a couple of really key parts. The idea is humans come in there. And one of the things I want us to always remember is we're talking about socio-technical systems. The things we're building are built out of technology, but they're built out of people. So these are a couple of the definitions we think about that. And I, of course, a few years ago, I went to Twitter and I said, well, we know what DevOps is. What is DevOps not? A couple things, you know, despite what you might think, DevOps is not copy-pasting from Stack Overflow. It's not just reading the Phoenix project. That's a good start. It's not just developers being on call, and it's not your khakis. So, old school doctor joke there. All right, so, quick, one last little bit of definition so we kind of see. You've probably heard, you may or may not have heard, DevOps described as CAMs, or COMs, or CLAMs, depending on, or SMALC, depending on how you want to rearrange these. So this idea, this acronym, actually it's an initialism, head entry of HO, came about in 2010. John Willis and David Edwards scrawled this down on a napkin at Mountain View, and it stood up all this time. And so it stands for culture, automation, lean, measurement, and sharing. And there's a reason that 11 years later, 12 years later, wait, what's 2010? Yeah, 12 years later, we're still talking about it. And I'm going to not dwell on this too much, but you might see people referring to this throughout the day. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about what we can do with it. So culture. Culture is the hard part. Why do we talk about culture all the time? You know why? Because it's frickin' hard, right? The tech is easy. People are hard. You think Kubernetes is hard? Go try dealing with people sometime, right? And this is one of the parts. I've had this on a slide in almost all of my talks for probably the last 10 years. And Lloyd Taylor, who nobody remembers him, nobody even remembers what Nogoko was, but I love this quote. He says, you can't change culture, right? And how many times, I'm sure we've all had leadership, we all had C-suites that are like, we're going to change the culture. You're like, okay, cool, how? Well, what you can do is behavior. Behavior gets changed, and that becomes culture. A lot of times I'll get asked, people say, Maddie, what is the most important DevOps book I should read? And I say, go read the book Freakonomics and go learn about incentives, and then you will understand cultural transformation. There's nothing about Kubernetes and Freakonomics, but there should be. So automation. This is the easy one, right? And also just, again, a call back to Jez and David. I love this line from the Continuous Delivery book, which basically says asking experts to do boring and repetitive tasks that are technically demanding is pretty much the surest way to ensure error short of sleep deprivation or them being drunk. So this is why we automate. We automate for scale. I also am pretty sure at a DevOpsDays I don't need to tell anybody why we automate shit, right? This is the easy one. Lean might be one that's a little different. Jez Humble added this to the equation a few years after it started, and we're really thinking about lean management, lean manufacturing principles. This is a whole other talk. I'm not going to give you a whole primer on lean, but the biggest thing about lean is we're talking about waste reduction, and we're talking about optimizing our process and our value stream. And if you're into this, there's a cat named Steve Pereira who's spoken at a lot of DevOps days, gives great talks about value stream mapping. The thing that is interesting about this to me is when I've worked with organizations as they're going through these cultural and DevOps transformations, sometimes it's the first time that anyone is holistically looking at the whole cycle, the commit to cache, the idea to deploy, and we find all this waste because we live in our silo. And by the way, you hear a lot at DevOps days, a lot of DevOps here, silos are bad, okay? You know what? Go talk to someone in agriculture. Silos are actually good. They exist for a reason. So I like to think about building bridges instead of breaking down silos. But we need to continue to think things through. And then the other two are measurement, kind of is self-explanatory. This is how we know we're improving. This is how we know we're affecting a change. And sharing. This is one that's really hard, especially in large organizations. Because number one, in a lot of larger organizations that have bureaucratic or more dangerous culture, like information is power, right? Or information can be perceived as a way to be blamed. There's also a lot of times our leadership, or those of us in leadership, or our leadership, depending whether, feel like, well, there's a need to know basis. The reality is, what is truly, quote, need to know is generally a much shorter list than we think it is. And the more that we share our successes. Cool, well this sounds awesome, right? Okay, cool, I'm into this DevOps thing. I'm sitting back here and I'm thinking back to myself when I'm driving down, it was many years ago, listening to podcasts, I'm in DevOps and stuff, I'm like, this sounds awesome. I cannot imagine, 10 years from now, the world's gonna change, the industry, we're gonna be doing all this cool shit. What the hell happened? We're not doing this, right? This is not the reality of DevOps today. A lot of us are doing these things. So this is not no shit. Actually, you're all at a DevOps day, so you're ahead of the game. But when we look back at this vision of DevOps, and we look at this world of 2022, where we're at today, there's kind of a disconnect. So what happened? Well, one of the things was we kind of thought DevOps is just about automation, right? How many people, you don't have to raise your hand, and Josh already exercised your up and down moment, but just mentally raise your hand. Have been either a part of a DevOps team or know of one or hear that where if you were to ask people in the organization, what does your DevOps folks do? It's all about automation. That's the whole thing, right? That's cool, and if you're an automation team, awesome, I love automation. I work at Chef, I work at Palumi. Automation is my jam, right? But it's not just about automation. That's one of the things. And frankly, it's the easiest one. Because number one, we don't have to convince engineers to play with automation. Number one, if you're a sysadmin like me, you're lazy as shit, right? So we're into it. And it's fun, right? So it's not, but we kind of became this thing where it's DevOps tools or automation tools. I mean, is it just Kubernetes, right? I dig Kubernetes. My license plate says kubectl, okay? But Kubernetes is not DevOps. DevOps is not Kubernetes. But we kind of got into this thing where it's if we just throw a lot of container orchestration at it, and a shitload of YAML, then we're going to DevOps everything and everything's going to get better, right? And this is one of my favorites. Years ago, there was a thankfully short-lived movement called enterprise DevOps. And the idea is it was DevOps without the C. Because in the enterprise, you don't need that squishy culture, empathy bullshit. We do real work in the enterprise. And thank God that Gene Kim and folks came along and ran the DevOps Enterprise Summit. We had all these folks doing enterprise work to show us that no, they did it the same way. But one of the people who led that movement, whose name is kind of lost in history, and I'm not going to bring it up now, but he was famous for saying culture is for yogurt. Right? And I was like, what the hell? Right? So, but this is the thing. This is how we believe. We're it's not about the people. It's about all this stuff. So here's the root problem. We talk about root cause. If you know me, you know I hate the word root cause. And there's multiple contributing factors. There is one root cause of the problem we have in DevOps. DevOps is being sold to you. The only root cause is capitalism. Actually, the real root cause is the Big Bang, but And here's the deal, right? You can't buy DevOps, but I can sell it to you. And this is a really important quote that you should memorize because it was said by someone who's really smart and influential, and that's me. But this is super true, right? You can't buy DevOps, but we will absolutely sell it to you. So this is sort of how we got to where we're at. Now, I'm standing up here in my vendor shirt, I'm part of the problem, but it's okay. We got good solutions. And then we kind of ran into this scenario, right? We started with DevOps, and again, said before, Andrew Clay Schaefer, visionary, smart dude, awesome guy to have sushi with. You highly recommend. My God, I wish he didn't call it this. Because we're well, we have DevOps, so it's about software engineers and operation folks. So we better have DevSecOps, because security matters. Okay, cool, well, biz DevOps. Okay, by the way, you're all in the business. We all are. The business is everybody. right? Serverless DevOps, right? Because we're going to do DevOps different if we've got serverless, and then we probably need to like, what the hell happened to my clicker? Oh my God. Of course, yeah, no, skip for now. There we go. It had to do an update, right? This was going to be awesome, right? Okay, here we go. DevSecOps, right? Because you have to have database in there because otherwise, your data's going to blow up. And I mean, you got to DevOps your DevOps. So this is like we have all these portmanteaus and we just keep adding more and more things. And I love it, like El Marquez talks about. She says, in DevOps, the sec is silent. It's always been, right? It's a meme with the astronaut. You mean it's always been? Yes, it always has been. But we have all these words. And they're not helping, to be quite frank, right? We're just redefining and we're redefining. So remember I said people are hard, okay? You know what's also really hard is words, especially short words, right? We don't do well with nuance. I don't know how many of you have ever been on Twitter. Nuance, not something humans are great at, especially short things. So words are hard. And I want everybody to sort of absorb that, understand it. This is my empathy to you, that we're using a lot of words. This is hard to understand, but don't worry, I have more words for you. So we're going to solve this problem with even more words. And the words that we're going to talk about now is this idea of cloud engineering, okay? So this is kind of an emergent practice. You may have heard people talking about it. It's not invented by any one person or group, but we talk about this idea of cloud engineering. And when you think about one of the ways to describe it is employing standard software practices and tools across our infrastructure, across our app dev, across our compliance and security. Wow, this sounds a lot like what we thought DevOps was going to be all about, right? So it's pretty similar, but maybe it's a little more specific. And when we think about what we do as cloud engineers, and whatever your title, by the way, whatever your title is, I'm here for you. That's awesome. Like, call yourself whatever you want that gets you paid. Awesome. If you call yourself a DevOps engineer, actually, honestly, most people who have the title DevOps engineer don't call themselves DevOps engineer. Someone else gave you that title. Awesome. Get paid. Call yourself, get a title as a cloud engineer. Be the director of DevOps. Call yourself Josh Atwell. Whatever you got to do to get paid is cool. All right. But when we think about this idea of cloud engineering, we're taking cloud resources of some kind, and we're building these platforms upon which we deploy our applications that provide value, but then we have to manage them, right? They continue to go. This is sort of that cycle, like you think about the infamous infinity loop of DevOps, right? This is what we continue to do, and we keep drawing new and new pictures. But at the end of the day, this is what we're doing. So we have this idea of build and deploy and manage. And I kind of call them tenets. You might call them pillars, but I feel like the observability folks kind of pissed everybody off when they talked about pillars. So I don't know. We call them pillars, we call them tenets, but we're going to things. I call them things. The things are build, deploy, and manage. So what I'm going to do is think about build and deploy and manage as part of what we do. And how does that map to what we've been saying this whole time with comms, with these ideas of culture and automation and where they come in? Because one of the things that happened, we were very early on in the DevOps movement, we wanted to be as non-prescriptive as possible, right? It was like, DevOps contains multitudes. You DevOps the way that makes you happy. There's just a couple things to do, do comms. Okay, great, that's telling you an idea. But that doesn't tell you how to do it, right? Like I remember I think it was in 2015, Kevin Bears, one of the authors of the Phoenix Project, said, if I see one more talk at a DevOpsDays that talks about empathy without actually telling people how to do it, right? Like we kind of get it. I actually have a talk called, okay, you've convinced me we have to collaborate, now how the hell do I deal with people? We understand the ideas, but how do we apply them? So if we think about the build tenet, and we think about where this comes in with comms. So this sounds like dev, right? This sounds like software, like slinging code. But it's not just about, build is not just about writing the code. This is about creating the services and the infrastructure that provide the value to our customers. And in today's world, we tend to assemble these things out of some type of cloud resource. So when we think about the ideas, maybe we do this with some type of a shared service platform. This is really popular. This is the new hotness right now, because we're gonna build these developer platforms and all this stuff inside our organization. That's a whole other conversation. But if you want to do that, that's awesome. And it's actually cool because at the end of the day, James Governor from Red Monk has said over and over again, all we're trying to do is reinvent Heroku, right? So that's the end result of what we want to do. But we're thinking about having reusable components, right? We don't want to repeat, like how do we continue to focus on the thing that continues to provide value? And we want to apply existing frameworks and tools, right? We already have ecosystems that are powerful. We have ways of doing stuff. Like when I think about how I would give a DevOps talk 8 years ago, I would be talking about what can operations people learn from software developers and vice versa. So this is still true, right? Why are we going to go and create new things? We have huge ecosystems that we can leverage, okay? So when we think about these ideas of build, how do they apply to each of the ideas of comms, right? So when we think about a cultural thing, again, we focus on the differentiator, right? What's the thing that's special for you? It's appropriate for me to tell a slight, small Red Hat story, because I'm here in Raleigh. So I spent a year working at Red Hat, and I was selling transformation to state and local governments in the United States. Boy, that's a lot of fun. But one of the things that would come up is I would talk, and people want to build their own shit, and you're like, I'm sorry, are you the Texas Department of Continuous Delivery? Right? It's like, no, that's not what you do. And this happens in private sector as well. And there's a company in Minneapolis that's infamous for this. And I'm like, you guys sell retail stuff. You don't, I can say that this DevOps day is not my own. But the differentiator, right? So our culture idea is what we're building is the thing that provides extra value. Charity Majors, one of my favorite lines from Charity is, the best tool is the one you don't need, the second best one is a SaaS, right? You build the stuff that makes you special, because you do have things that make you special. And having a common development experience, right? Whether we're using it for infra code, building our infrastructure, building our applications, doing our security, this actually breeds that empathy, because we have a common way of working together, right? It's building those bridges. It's like I know what I was going to say. Cool. Okay. So the automation piece of this, when we're creating things, we want reusable components. How can we share things? How can we create one thing in one particular place and reuse it somewhere else? And that's lends itself that's just sort of a little bit part of common software development in the last 20 years, right? Packages and things like that. But how do we apply that to everything that we're doing, right? And leveraging the ecosystems like I talked about, and avoiding a bespoke implementation, and I mean even specific within your squad, within your part of the business, right? We kind of always have ways that we do it inside our own little particular place. And we're moving ourselves away from the value creation and being able to share. So it's whether you think about this as an inner source kind of scenario, something like that. Okay, where does lean come in? I guess the focus on value, right? So lean is about the value stream. We talked about focusing on the differentiator. It's deriving our efficiency. Efficiency is a tricky word, and I really hesitated putting it on the slide, right? Because this could mean a lot of different things, right? So it's not, people will work to the Nash Pareto equilibrium, which is people will work to the way you measure them, even to the detriment of the organization. So efficiency can be a very dangerous Nash Pareto, but being the efficiency not of individuals, but the efficiency of you as an organization. And it gives the ability to continue review for improvement. That's the thing about lean, is we're continually looking at it and saying, we're continually looking at our process. And then what are we measuring? So consistency breeds visibility. If we do things consistently, we can actually compare them, right? We can say, we're always building things this way. We can see that we're moving the needle, because the thing that matters is not the value of the needle, it's that the needle moved in the direction we want it to move in. Going back to the 10 deploys a day at Flickr thing. There's no, sure, Amazon deploys 100,000 times a minute. That doesn't mean you need to. You can deploy once a week if that's what's right for your business, right? So the point of that is, but by doing it consistently, then we can see that the needle's moving. And then the sharing piece of that, we talked about reusable components. And then even by using a larger ecosystem, we have the promise of open source, supposedly, right? Which is breeding this sharing outside of that and being able to, the sum is greater than the whole is greater than something. How does it go? Whatever. Some math thing, right? And we can learn from those existing practices. So then when we think about the deploying, so the thing with deploy, right, it doesn't count until it's in prod, right? That's cool, but unless you're actually getting it in front of people, where you're getting feedback, and this all goes back to the principles of DevOps and Agile and all of this, which is getting that fast feedback. So we want to be able to kind of come into those pieces. And the thing about deploy is, one is we do it the same way every time, okay? Now, how many of you have been in a scenario where cool, we have a consistent process, except for when there's a thing, or there's a thing, there's a thing. There's always an exception. The thing is, when you have the ability for an exception, everything becomes an exception. So we're just doing it the same way every time. Another great phrase I like is, if something is painful, do it more often, right? So we come in again, and I mean every time, right? That also builds our muscle memory and actually helps us improve the process really quickly because we're constantly doing it. Back when I worked at PagerDuty, I might say something like, if you want to get better at handling incidents, have you tried having more incidents, right? So it's true. And this gives us quality and security checks. And security is just another aspect of quality when this comes in. And that's one of the things to just generally keep in mind. And I have a whole other talk I've given where I believe very strongly in democratizing your security testing. Just like you think about this, if you had, say you're doing some project, it's like a 6-sprint long project, and you're like, we're not going to do any QA testing until the last sprint. If I said that, you would think I was nuts. Or you would have worked in some of the places I've worked at in the past. But we do that with security all the time. Still, even today, in this beautiful world of DevSecOps, we still have a hardening sprint, right? And just like a defect related to a functional test, the closer to the introduction that we find it, the easier it is to fix it. So we need to move, this is what shift left means. I'm not going to go off on a whole other rant. Shift left does not mean move the responsibility to the people on the left. It means move the idea to earlier in the process. Again, remember, nuance. We screw that up all the time. Cool. Now, what about checklists? So checklists are awesome, right? So what you're doing there, though, is it's not a manual checklist. Like, take that checklist of things you always do. So you, as the smart human, develop the checklist. Let the robots check the checklist for you. So if you've read the Checklist Manifesto, I think that's the name of the book, the Checklist Manifesto. Checklists are amazing. And then, again, think about how your infrastructure is part of your application. The only reason we have infrastructure is to deliver our application. And as a multi-decade sysadmin, boy, was that hard for me to write on a slide, right? I'm like, but that's the reason. So we want those things to go. So when we think, I'm going to go a little quickly here because we still have to get into the last ones, but from a culture perspective, it's when we're talking about deploying, it doesn't count till it's in prod and then iterative development, right? This is just, this applies to these things, enables our continuous improvement. The automation, this is just like, again, automation I don't have to tell you a lot about because this is the thing we all pay attention to. We talk about the automated checks, we love checklists, let's automate them. When the lean part comes in, this is again helping us with that fast feedback when we're deploying things. And it's giving us visibility into our supply chain. How many people have heard about like software bill of materials and software supply chain in the last 6 months, all of a sudden something we care about, right? This is a way that helps. And the lean part actually helps. Helps us find bottlenecks. Another thing, if you've read The Goal, if you've read Phoenix Project, you know that optimizing anything outside of your largest bottleneck is actually counterproductive, so we need to have a way to find them. Again, we want our visibility. We can measure our cycle time so we understand how we're moving. And it's not just speed, right? Doing it fast is doing it at the velocity that is required to provide the value that your business needs to your end users. Again, visibility, right? Like this all just comes into how do we see things. A common pipeline means less duplication of effort. So the more that across all of our groups we're doing things the same way, we can build it, we can repeat it. And then everybody knows what changed, right? That's the thing, because I mean, change is what introduces change, right? So we want to be able to see and understand it, not to blame it. And then finally, when we think about manage is giving us visibility. You can think about this as your day 2 operations. This is your compliance, whether it's what I call capital C compliance or lowercase c compliance, whether it's like a regulated compliance requirement or just the policies of your organization. You've heard security is everyone's job. Again, that doesn't mean you as a developer have to do everybody's job, but we want to have an awareness and a thought and an understanding about it. And this allows us by having a common vocabulary. We're speaking the same language about it. This goes into, rather than having our security folks or our compliance folks give us some PDF of like all the vulnerabilities they found and then we have to go figure out if there's a way we can collaborate, preferably in code, preferably in some type of automation. We're speaking the same thing. And then these controls and process enable and enhance. Guardrails are pretty awesome. Like a lot of times we feel like a guardrail is a thing that gets in our way of us being able to do things, but a guardrail actually helps us have a lot more confidence. right? If I know that I'm protected from probably completely dropping all the tables in prod, I'm feeling a little more comfortable, right? I don't feel insulted by that. I'm like, please do that. Protect me from myself. Okay. So these slides we're going to probably go through pretty quick, but there's a bunch of good stuff. I will put the link to the slides at the end, but I'm running out of time. So this is one that I think is really important, though. Computers can't lie. Okay, how many people have been part of an audit that felt like absolute bullshit because they asked you and they said, hey, Mike, did you do this thing? You're, Computers can't lie. Computers also can't do favors for you, right? So if you have a rule to deploy, like I could go and be like, hey, Josh, come on, just let it go. And be like, okay, that's cool, we'll do that. You know, computers are like, nope, didn't pass the test, screw you, Maddie, right? That gives a trust of the process and checks, and our policy goes from vague to understandable. Last couple things here. This is, I think, the last one's important. Identify when policy and value collide, right? We'll run into that. We'll have a policy, but then we're like, but this is actually getting in the way of us providing value, and we can have a conversation about it, right? And collaborate. And talked about this. We share our learning. So this is my challenge to you. Let's take DevOps back, right? DevOps is being sold to us, kind of changed, kind of did this thing. Let's take this opportunity to make DevOps what we want it to be, what it's supposed to have been all along, that we believe in. This is our opportunity. My name is Maddie Stratton. You can find me in all these places. If you want to find the slides, you can go to pulumi.com/Maddie. There's a link to them. There's a bunch of other crap I do. I told you I wasn't going to talk about Pulumi anymore, but one more thing. We have our conference on May the 4th. And it's an online conference, but the first 500 people get like super dope Star Wars themed Pulumi Puss t-shirts. So if you missed that, that's cool. And then I think, yeah, that's it.